morning sun shone through the tall windows of the Galactic Defense Academy as hundreds of young people from across the galaxy filled the great hall. Their voices mixed together in dozens of languages while they waited for the day's combat rankings to be announced. Some wore expensive uniforms from the core worlds. Others had simple clothes that showed they came from farming planets or mining colonies. Jasmine Crockett stood near the front of the crowd, her dark hair perfectly styled, and her academy uniform pressed without a single wrinkle. She came from Centauri Prime, one of the richest worlds in the galaxy, and everyone knew it. Her father owned 3 shipping companies and her mother served on the Colonial Senate. Jasmine had never wanted for anything in her 20 years of life. She looked around the room with sharp green eyes, taking note of who might challenge her for the top spot in today's test results. Most of the other students gave her plenty of space. She had earned that respect through 2 years of perfect scores and flawless performance in every simulation. The instructors praised her tactical mind and her ability to think 3 steps ahead of any opponent. Near the back of the hall, almost hidden in the shadows between 2 support pillars, sat a young man who drew no attention at all. Kash Patel wore plain brown clothes that looked like they had been mended more than once. His black hair needed cutting and his hands showed the rough calluses of someone who had done real work before coming to the academy. He sat alone, reading from a worn datapad while the other students talked and laughed around him. Jasmine had noticed Kash during their first week at the academy 6 months ago. He never spoke unless asked a direct question, never joined the study groups, and never tried to make friends with anyone. In combat simulations, he performed well enough to pass, but never pushed for the highest scores. She had decided he was either lazy or stupid, maybe both. The main doors at the front of the hall opened with a soft hiss and Commander Lisa Hayes walked in. The room fell quiet immediately. Commander Hayes had fought in the Outer Rim Wars and carried scars on her left arm that everyone could see. She never talked about how she got those scars, but the stories said she had held off an entire pirate fleet with just 3 ships, while civilians escaped from a burning space station. "Attention," Commander Hayes said in her clear, strong voice. "Today's combat simulation results are ready." A large screen dropped from the ceiling and filled with names and numbers. The students pressed forward to see where they ranked. Jasmine smiled as she saw her name at the very top with a score of 98.7 out of 100. The next closest student had scored 94.2. She had beaten everyone by more than 4 points. Her eyes moved down the list, looking for the names of students she knew. Most scored in the 80s and 90s, which meant they had done well. But near the bottom of the list, she found what she was looking for. Kash Patel had scored 71.8, barely passing the minimum requirement of 70. "Pathetic," Jasmine said, loud enough for several students nearby to hear. "Some people just don't belong here." She turned and walked toward where Kash still sat in the back. The other students moved aside to let her pass, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Kash looked up from his datapad as she approached, his dark brown eyes meeting hers calmly. "Congratulations on another spectacular failure, Patel," Jasmine said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet hall. 71.8 points. "I'm honestly impressed you managed to score that high." Kash said nothing, just looked at her with those steady eyes. His silence made Jasmine even more angry. She had expected him to defend himself or make excuses, but he just sat there like a stone. "You know what your problem is?" she continued, stepping closer. "You think you can coast by on whatever farm boy tricks you learned back on whatever dirt planet you crawled out of. But this is the real galaxy, Patel. This is where actual warriors train to defend civilization from real threats." A few students behind her laughed nervously. Jasmine felt encouraged by their response and pushed harder. "Maybe you should go back to growing vegetables or milking space cows or whatever it is your people do out there in the middle of nowhere. Leave the fighting to those of us who actually understand what war means." More laughter now, some of it genuine. Jasmine felt the familiar rush of power that came from being the center of attention, from proving her superiority over someone weaker. She had learned early in life that there were winners and losers in every situation, and she refused to be anything but a winner. Kash slowly closed his datapad and stood up. He was taller than Jasmine had expected, with broad shoulders that his loose clothes had hidden. For a moment she thought he might finally say something to defend himself. Instead, he picked up his small bag and walked toward the door without speaking a single word. "That's right, run away," Jasmine called after him. "Maybe if you practice real hard, you might score 72 points next time." The laughter followed Kash as he left the hall, but he never looked back or changed his pace. He walked out with the same quiet dignity he had shown while sitting in his chair. Commander Hayes watched the whole scene from her position near the front screen. She made notes on her personal datapad, her face showing nothing of what she thought. She had seen this kind of behavior before, both the cruel mockery and the silent endurance. In her experience, the students who laughed loudest often learned the hardest lessons when real trouble came. As the crowd began to break up and head to their next classes, she noticed that several students avoided looking directly at Jasmine. They had laughed along with her joke, but something about Kash Patel's quiet exit had left them uncomfortable. There had been something in his eyes, a depth that suggested more strength than his test scores showed. Commander Hayes had learned, long ago, not to judge a warrior by how they performed in simulations. Real battle had a way of revealing who people truly were, and she suspected that both Jasmine Crockett and Kash Patel would surprise everyone before their training was complete. 3 months passed at the academy before the emergency sirens woke everyone at dawn. Jasmine rolled out of her bed in the officer quarters, confused by the harsh red lights flashing in her room. She had never heard those particular alarms before, but their urgent tone made her stomach tighten with fear. Students ran through the hallways in their sleeping clothes, all asking the same question. What was happening? The academy had drills every week, but this felt different. The instructors who usually stayed calm during emergencies now had worried faces as they herded everyone toward the main assembly hall. Commander Hayes stood on the stage with several other senior officers. Her uniform looked like she had put it on quickly, and her usually perfect hair was not quite in place. When she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that made the room fall completely silent. "Students, we have received word that hostile forces have attacked the Outer Rim colonies," she said. "As of 6 hours ago, the Zephyrian Confederation has declared war on the Galactic Alliance. 17 star systems have already gone dark." A wave of shocked whispers ran through the crowd. The Zephyrians were a mysterious species from beyond the known galaxy. They had made contact with the Alliance only 5 years ago, and the peace talks had seemed to be going well. No one had expected them to launch an attack. "All Academy training is suspended immediately," Commander Hayes continued. "Transport ships are being prepared to evacuate all students to safe zones in the core worlds. You will pack only essential items and be ready to leave within 4 hours. Jasmine felt the world tilt around her. This could not be happening. She was supposed to graduate in 8 months and take a position in the Colonial Defense Force. Her parents had already planned a celebration party on Centauri Prime. War was something that happened to other people, not to her. The next few hours passed in a blur of packing and confusion. Students who had been rivals and friends just hours before now clung together, scared and uncertain. The instructors tried to maintain order, but everyone could see the fear in their eyes too. Jasmine found herself on a transport ship called the Horizon's Edge along with 300 other students. The ship was designed to carry cargo, not passengers, so they had to sleep on the metal floor and share water rations. For someone who had grown up with servants in private rooms, the conditions felt like torture. She tried to find Kash Patel among the other students, though she was not sure why. Maybe she wanted to apologize for what she had said 3 months ago, or maybe she just wanted to see a familiar face. But he was nowhere to be found. When she asked other students, they said they had not seen him since the evacuation began. Ship's captain, a tough woman named Maria Santos, gave them updates every few hours. The news got worse each time. The Zephyrian fleet was not just attacking colonies. They were destroying everything in their path. Entire worlds were being wiped, clean of life. The enemy ships seemed to adapt to every weapon used against them, learning from each battle and becoming stronger. "They're not fighting like any enemy we've seen before," Captain Santos told them during one briefing. "Our standard tactics don't work against them. Every time our forces think they've figured out their pattern, the Zephyrians change it." Jasmine. watched the reports on the ship's main screen with growing horror. The tactical brilliance she had been so proud of seemed meaningless when faced with an enemy that could rewrite the rules of warfare in real time. All her perfect scores and simulation victories felt like children's games now. The refugee ship was crowded with people from dozens of worlds. Families who had lost everything sat quietly in corners, holding their children close. Businessmen, who had been worth millions just days ago, now begged for extra food rations. The social order that Jasmine had always known was falling apart. She found herself thinking about her parents on Centauri Prime. The core worlds were supposed to be safe, protected by the strongest defense fleets in the galaxy, but if the Zephyrians could destroy Outer Rim colonies so easily, what would stop them from pushing deeper into civilized space? Days passed as the Horizon's Edge moved through hyperspace, heading for a refugee camp on Kepler Station. The ship received constant messages from other vessels, all carrying the same desperate news. The enemy was advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. Military commanders who had fought for decades were running out of ideas. On the 5th day of their journey, Jasmine overheard 2 of the ship's officers talking in the corridor outside her sleeping area. They thought everyone was asleep, but she had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about what might happen to her family. "The Zephyrians hit the Vega system this morning," one officer said quietly. "Took out the entire defense fleet in less than 6 hours. That's 12 dreadnoughts and 40 smaller ships gone." "How are they doing it?" the other officer asked. "Our ships are supposed to be the best in the galaxy. Word is their technology adapts during battle. They analyze our weapons and defenses, then modify their own systems to counter them. By the time we figure out their weakness, they've already evolved past it." Jasmine felt her blood turn cold. She had studied military history for years, but she had never heard of anything like this. How could any species develop such advanced technology? And if they could adapt to any attack, how could they ever be stopped? The officers moved away, continuing their conversation in whispers. Jasmine was left alone with her thoughts and the quiet sounds of hundreds of people trying to sleep in an overcrowded cargo hold. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be truly afraid. She thought again about Kash Patel and wondered where he was now. Had he made it to safety, or was he trapped somewhere in the combat zones? She realized she barely knew anything about him beyond his name and his quiet manner. She had been so focused on proving her own superiority that she had never bothered to learn about the people around her. Now, as the galaxy burned and her perfect future crumbled, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in judging him so harshly. The refugee camp on Kepler Station looked like a small city made of metal boxes and temporary shelters. Thousands of people from the outer colonies lived there now, all waiting for news about the war. Jasmine had been there for 2 weeks, sleeping on a thin mattress in a room she shared with 7 other academy students. Every morning she joined the crowds gathered around the large screens that showed news from across the galaxy. The reports were always bad. More worlds had fallen to the Zephyrians. More fleets had been destroyed. The enemy kept pushing deeper into civilized space, and nothing seemed able to stop them. But on this particular morning, something different appeared on the screens. The news reporter, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, was reading from a datapad with a confused expression on his face. "We are receiving strange reports from the Sol system," he said slowly. "The Zephyrian advance fleet has encountered unexpected resistance near Earth. Details are limited, but early accounts suggest that human defense forces are engaging the enemy with unusual success." Jasmine felt her heart skip. Earth was where humans came from originally, though most of them had spread out across the galaxy over the past few centuries. She had never been there herself, but she knew it was considered one of the less important worlds in human space. Most of the wealthy and powerful humans lived on colonies like Centauri Prime or New Angeles. The reporter continued reading. According to Fleet Communications, several Zephyrian destroyer groups have been forced to retreat from Earth's outer defense perimeter. This is the first reported instance of enemy forces withdrawing from any engagement since the war began. A murmur went through the crowd. People looked at each other with expressions of hope mixed with disbelief. How could Earth, a simple farming and manufacturing world, succeed where the great military fleets had failed? Over the next few days, more reports came in from the Sol system. Human ships were not just defending Earth, they were actively hunting Zephyrian forces. Small groups of human vessels would appear out of nowhere, attack enemy formations with devastating precision, then disappear before the Zephyrians could respond. "It doesn't make sense," said Alex Turner, one of Jasmine's roommates. "From the Academy, Earth doesn't have a major fleet. Most of their ships are old cargo haulers and system patrol boats. How are they fighting destroyers and cruisers?" Jasmine had been wondering the same thing. She had studied the military strength of every major human world, and Earth had never been considered a serious military power. Their ships were decades behind the latest technology, and their crews were mostly former merchant sailors and local militia. The mystery deepened when actual battle recordings started reaching the refugee camps. Jasmine watched the footage on a small screen in the station's communication center, trying to understand what she was seeing. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed random at first, but as Jasmine studied them more carefully, she began to see a deadly logic. They would split into small groups, approach the enemy from multiple directions, then coordinate their attacks with perfect timing. When the Zephyrians tried to adapt their defenses, the humans would change tactics completely, using moves that seemed to come from an entirely different military doctrine. "They're not fighting like Academy graduates," Jasmine said to herself, watching a recording of 3 human frigates taking down a Zephyrian heavy cruiser. This is something else entirely. The most puzzling part was how calm the human ship captains sounded on their communication channels. While commanders from other worlds screamed orders and panic filled their voices during battle, the humans spoke quietly and efficiently. They sounded like they had been fighting this kind of war for years. General Patricia Stone, the human military representative at Kepler Station, became the center of attention as more people demanded answers. She was a stern woman in her 50s, with gray hair and sharp blue eyes. When reporters and refugees asked her about Earth's success, she would just smile and say the same thing every time. "You'll see soon enough," she would tell them. "Earth has been preparing for this kind of fight longer than most people realize, but preparing how and when?" Jasmine spent hours in the station's database, looking for information about Earth's military history. What she found confused her even more. According to official records, Earth had been largely peaceful for the past 50 years. They had a small defense force, but nothing that should be able to challenge the Zephyrians. Then she found older records, dating back to the early days of human expansion into space. The files told stories of brutal wars between human colonies, pirate raids that lasted for decades, and small conflicts that never made it into the official history books. Earth had been involved in many of these fights, but always quietly, always in the background. One file mentioned something called the Colonial Pacification Wars that had happened 60 years ago. Human colonies in the Outer Rim had rebelled against Earth's government, leading to a series of battles that lasted nearly a decade. The war had ended with a peace treaty, but the details were classified at the highest levels. Another file referenced the belt mining conflicts from 40 years ago. Pirates and corporate armies had fought over asteroid mining rights, turning entire solar systems into war zones. Again, Earth had been involved, but the specifics were marked as secret. Jasmine began to realize that maybe Earth's military history was not as peaceful as everyone believed. Maybe the quiet farmers and factory workers had more experience with real fighting than anyone knew. As she researched deeper, she found references to something called Reserve Command Protocol and Veteran Reactivation Systems. The files were heavily censored, but they suggested that Earth maintained some kind of hidden military structure, kept secret from the rest of the galaxy. The breakthrough came when she found a personnel file that had been misfiled in the civilian records. It belonged to someone named Vincent Patel, listed as a retired farmer from the Appalachian region of Earth. But buried in the file were service records that made Jasmine's eyes widen. Vincent Patel had served in the Colonial Pacification Wars as a colonel. He had commanded ground forces during the belt mining conflicts. He had been involved in something called Operation Silent Thunder that was so classified she could not even access the mission name. Patel, the same last name as Kash, the quiet student she had mocked at the academy. Jasmine sat back in her chair, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Kash had never talked about his family or his background. He had just said he came from a farming community on Earth. But what if there was more to his story? What if his quiet confidence came from growing up around people who had seen real war? Reports continued to come in from the Sol system, showing human forces pushing back the supposedly unstoppable Zephyrian fleet. Jasmine began to understand that she had badly misjudged not just Kash Patel, but perhaps all of humanity's quiet strength. Vincent Patel stood in his kitchen, looking out the window at the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. The morning sun painted the stalks golden, and a soft breeze made them sway like ocean waves. He had worked this land for 30 years, ever since he retired from military service and decided to build a quiet life for his family. The communication device on his table buzzed with an urgent message. Vincent glanced at it but did not hurry to answer. He had learned long ago that most emergencies were not as urgent as people believed. He finished pouring his coffee, added 2 spoonfuls of sugar, and then picked up the device. The message was from Earth Defense Command. Vincent read it slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. The Zephyrian fleet had entered the outer solar system. All retired military personnel were being asked to report for emergency consultation. The message was signed by General Amanda Foster, someone Vincent had served with during the Belt Wars 40 years ago. Vincent set down the communication device and walked to his bedroom. In the back of his closet, behind old work clothes and winter coats, sat a metal box he had not opened in decades. The lock still recognized his fingerprint after all these years. Inside the box were things he had hoped never to need again. His dress uniform, now tight across the shoulders but still perfectly maintained. Combat medals that represented battles most people had forgotten. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, his service weapon and the rank insignia of a full colonel. He had been 25 when he first put on that uniform. Now he was 68, with gray hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun while working his fields. His hands were stained with soil instead of gun oil, and his back ached from bending over crops instead of crouching in foxholes. But when Vincent picked up his old combat knife and felt its familiar weight, 30 years seemed to disappear. The muscle memory was still there, waiting just beneath the surface. A second message arrived as he was getting dressed. This one made him stop and read it 3 times. His son Kash was missing, presumed killed during the evacuation of the Galactic Defense Academy. The transport ship he had been assigned to had never reached its destination. Vincent stood perfectly still for a long moment, holding the message in his hands. Then he carefully folded it and put it in his uniform pocket. He would grieve for his son later when there was time. Right now, there was work to do. He walked to his desk and activated the old military communication system he had kept hidden in his basement for 30 years. The codes he entered were ones he had memorized as a young soldier and never forgotten. When the connection opened, a familiar voice answered. Earth Defense Command, General Foster speaking. Amanda, this is Vincent Patel, service number 7749 Alpha. I received your message. There was a pause, then General Foster's voice came back warmer but still professional. Vincent, thank God. We need you and every other veteran we can find. The situation is worse than the public knows. How bad? The Zephyrians have technology that adapts to everything we throw at them. Standard fleet tactics are useless. We've lost 17 battle groups in the past month, and they're learning from every engagement. Vincent looked out his window again at the peaceful farmland. In a few hours, enemy ships would be close enough to see those same fields from space. What do you need from me? We're activating Reserve Protocol 7. All retired combat personnel, full reactivation with emergency authority. You'll have command of Orbital Defense Platform Charlie, plus whatever ships we can scrape together. Reserve Protocol 7. Vincent had helped write those orders 30 years ago, hoping they would never be used. It meant Earth was preparing for total war, the kind of fighting that left nothing standing when it was over. I'll be there in 4 hours, he said. Vincent, General Foster said quietly. There's something else. We intercepted Zephyrian communications. They think Earth is going to be easy because our fleet is small and our technology is old. They don't know about the veterans. Vincent almost smiled at that. The galaxy had been peaceful for so long that most people had forgotten what humans were like when they had to fight for survival. The young officers in the academy learned tactics from books and simulations. They had never seen what happened when old soldiers stopped pretending to be farmers and shopkeepers and remembered how to kill. He made one more call before leaving the farm. The number belonged to Robert Chen, who ran a small repair shop in town. Robert answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting. "Vincent? Bobby, it's time. Pass the word to everyone on the list. How long do we have? Maybe 6 hours before they reach the inner system. Can you get everyone to the rally points?" "They've been ready for years, Vincent. We all have." Vincent ended the call and looked around his kitchen one last time. The coffee pot was still warm, and sunlight still streamed through the windows. It looked exactly the same as it had every morning for 30 years. But everything had changed. He picked up his old service bag and walked to his truck. As he drove toward the spaceport, he passed other farms and small towns. At first, everything looked normal. Then he began to notice the signs. Old men were coming out of retirement homes, walking with more purpose than they had shown in years. Women were hugging their grandchildren goodbye and climbing into vehicles they had not driven in decades. The galaxy was about to remember that Earth's peaceful farmers and quiet shopkeepers had once been the most dangerous soldiers in human space, and now they were putting their uniforms back on. Vincent thought about his son Kash as he drove. The boy had inherited his quiet strength and his steady hands, but Vincent had hoped he would never need to use those gifts in war. Now Kash was gone, and Vincent was going to make sure the people responsible paid for taking him. The old soldiers were awakening, and their enemies had no idea what was coming for them. The battle for Earth began at dawn when the Zephyrian fleet dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter. Their ships were massive and sleek, covered in biomechanical armor that shifted and changed as they moved. Intelligence reports said there were over 200 vessels, enough firepower to crack a planet in half. Vincent Patel stood on the command deck of Orbital Defense Platform Charlie, watching the enemy fleet approach on the main screen. Around him, men and women who had been living quiet civilian lives just hours ago now wore military uniforms and worked at combat stations. Their hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, muscle memory taking over from decades of retirement. "Sir, we're receiving surrender demands from the enemy fleet," reported Lieutenant Karen Walsh, a woman who had been teaching elementary school the day before. "They want us to power down all defenses and prepare for occupation." Vincent looked at the communication panel, then at the faces of his crew. These people had raised families, run businesses, and built peaceful lives. But underneath those civilian identities, they were still the soldiers who had fought in the colonial wars and the belt conflicts. They had earned the right to live in peace. And now someone was trying to take that away. "Send a reply," Vincent said quietly. "Tell them no." The Zephyrian response came quickly. Their lead ships accelerated toward Earth, weapons charging with energy that made space itself seem to bend around them. On the platform's sensors, Vincent could see their adaptive technology already analyzing Earth's defenses, preparing to counter whatever weapons the humans might use. But the Zephyrians had made a critical mistake. They expected to fight the same kind of war they had been winning across the galaxy. They were ready for high-tech battles with advanced fleets using standard military doctrine. They were not ready for what Vincent Patel had learned in 40 years of real fighting. "All units, this is Colonel Patel," he said into his communication system. "Execute pattern Delta 7. Across the solar system, human ships that had been hiding in asteroid fields and behind moons suddenly came to life. But instead of charging at the enemy in formation, they scattered in dozens of different directions. Some headed toward Jupiter's moons, others dove toward the sun, and a few seemed to be running away entirely. The Zephyrian fleet paused, confused by this apparently chaotic response. Their adaptive systems tried to analyze the human tactics, but there was no pattern to analyze. Each group of ships was doing something completely different. That confusion lasted exactly 30 seconds. Then Vincent's trap closed. The human ships that had scattered toward Jupiter swung around the planet's gravity well and came screaming back at incredible speed. The ones that had dove toward the sun used solar winds to accelerate beyond anything the Zephyrians had seen. Even the ships that seemed to be retreating suddenly turned and attacked from unexpected angles. But the real surprise was the weapons. Instead of using the advanced energy systems the Zephyrians expected, the human ships fired old-fashioned kinetic rounds, explosive missiles, and plasma charges that had been standard 50 years ago. The enemy's adaptive technology had no recent data on these weapons, and their defenses were not prepared for them. "Direct hit on enemy Cruiser 7, called out Sandra Miller, who had been running a flower shop just yesterday. "Their shields are down 60%. Vincent watched the battle unfold with grim satisfaction. The Zephyrians were learning, just as they always did. But they were learning the wrong lessons. Every time they adapted to counter one type of attack, the humans would switch to something completely different. Old tactics that had been forgotten for decades suddenly became devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never seen them before. The key was not trying to out-technology the Zephyrians. It was fighting the kind of war that humans had, perfected long before they met any alien species. Dirty fighting. Unpredictable fighting. The kind of warfare that came from generations of humans killing other humans over every scrap of resources in hostile space. Enemy destroyer group moving to flank our position, reported Communications Officer James Park, a former insurance salesman. "They're trying to get behind the platform." "Let them come," Vincent said. He had been waiting for this move. "All fighters, execute Broken Wing Protocol." A squadron of small human fighters that had been limping away from the battle, apparently damaged and retreating, suddenly reversed course. They had been pretending to be crippled to draw the enemy destroyers into a trap. Now they swarmed the Zephyrian ships from below, while Platform Charlie hit them from above. The battle raged for 6 hours. Every time the Zephyrians thought they had figured out human tactics, Vincent would order his forces to do something completely different. His people fought like pirates and rebels, like desperate survivors who would use any trick to stay alive. They mined asteroid fields, used debris as weapons, and turned their own damaged ships into guided missiles. Most importantly, they fought with a coordination that came from years of shared experience. These old soldiers had trained together, bled together, and trusted each other with their lives long before the Zephyrians had ever left their home galaxy. As the enemy fleet began to retreat, Vincent received a communication that made his heart leap. A damaged transport ship was approaching Earth, broadcasting human identification codes. On the screen, he saw a familiar face. "Dad?" Kash Patel's voice was weak but clear. "I heard you were back in uniform." Vincent felt tears in his eyes for the first time since the battle began. His son was alive, had been helping coordinate evacuations in the Outer Rim, and was finally making it home. "Welcome back, son," Vincent said. "We saved some fighting for you." The Zephyrian fleet jumped back into hyperspace, their first real defeat in months of conquest. Across the galaxy, the news spread quickly. Earth had not just survived, they had won. In the refugee camps and core worlds, people watched the battle recordings with amazement. Jasmine Crockett, still stuck on Kepler Station, finally understood what she had seen in Kash Patel's quiet confidence. It was not weakness or stupidity. It was the calm strength that came from growing up around people who had earned their peace through war. When Vincent Patel took off his uniform and went back to his farm, the galaxy was a different place. The Zephyrians still had a massive fleet, but they now knew that humans could not be conquered easily. More importantly, humanity remembered what it meant to fight for survival. The old wolves had awakened, and their enemies would never again mistake human silence for human weakness.